Hello and welcome to another History Burst video. This one's going to focus on Elizabeth I and her court. So Elizabeth became Queen of England in 1558 and many people at the time felt that this meant she could not rule alone. However, Elizabeth had a number of strengths as a ruling monarch. So she inherited the throne from her sister Mary. However, Elizabeth's position on the throne was insecure, as her mother, Anne Boleyn, or Henry VIII's second wife, had been executed for treason. Elizabeth was then declared illegitimate, and so there were doubts about her right to rule. Also, Elizabeth was Protestant, and while many of her subjects, especially in the north of England, were Catholic, and this meant Elizabeth had to be politically clever if she was going to survive. So, a key part of understanding Elizabeth I and her reign is to understand her background and character. So she was confident and charismatic, which enabled her to win over her subjects and command support in Parliament. She was well educated and spoke Latin, Greek, French and Italian. She was resilient, and she had spent time in the Tower accused of treason and facing possible execution. She could cope with the pressure then of being queen. She had an excellent grasp of politics. She understood the interests and ambitions of her subjects and was able to use her powers of patronage effectively. And although she was Protestant, the number of Protestants in England was growing, making her position as queen more secure. She could claim divine right with growing confidence. Elizabeth used her strengths to reinvent herself as a different type of monarch. She liked to show that she was no ordinary woman, and she argued that she could govern England on her own and did not need to marry. Throughout her reign, she portrayed herself as a strong, legitimate, popular monarch who was married only to the country and not to a king. The court was one of the many institutions of Elizabethan government, which also included the Privy Council, Parliament, Lord Lieutenants and Justices of the Peace. So at the centre was Elizabeth I. The court was made up of noblemen who acted as the monarch's advisors and friends, and they advised the Queen and helped display her wealth and power. Members of the court could also be members of the Privy Council. The Privy Council was made up of the nobility who helped govern the country. They monitored Parliament and Justices of the Peace, or JPs, and oversaw law and order and the security of the country. So the Queen would appoint Justices of the Peace, who were large landowners appointed by the government, who kept law and order locally and heard court cases. She also appointed Lord Lieutenants, and they were noblemen appointed by the government who governed English counties and raided local militia. Then we've got Parliament, who monitored and advised the Queen. And they advised Elizabeth's government, made up of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Lords was made up of noblemen and bishops. The House of Commons was elected, though very few people could actually vote. Parliament passed laws and approved taxes. Extraordinary taxation or extra taxes required to pay for unexpected expenses, especially war. So JPs and Lord Lieutenants were part of the local government and ran different parts of England on behalf of the Queen. The court, the Privy Council and Parliament helped to run the country as a whole. Patronage was an integral part of Elizabeth's court, and this was where the monarch rewarded her supporters by granting them lands, jobs and titles. People who received these lands or positions could use them to become wealthy. So how did the court work? Well, courtiers could try to use their presence to influence the Queen, and the court involved up to 2,000 people. Of those, many were employed as servants to protect and provide for the court. There was a very strict dress code, and courtiers were expected to wear cloths made of gold and silver cloths and dyed velvet, as well as ruffs, which expanded in size over the course of Elizabeth's reign. So attending court could become an expensive business. The court also took care of Elizabeth's personal needs, such as food, accommodation and entertainment, and helped her govern. The court would often meet at one of Elizabeth's many palaces, such as Greenwich and Hampton Court. Elizabeth's court moved around the country on royal progresses, staying at the houses of members of the nobility who had to meet the expense of entertaining the Queen and her courtiers. and this included providing hospitality as well as gifts for the Queen. Elizabeth was also able to use the court to control her public image. And for example, she used portraits put across the image of herself as a woman in control of her court and her country. So Elizabeth had a number of key advisors and ministers, including William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, and Francis Walsingham. We're going to start off looking at Lord Burleigh, or William Cecil. So he was Elizabeth's longest serving minister or advisor. He became Secretary of State in 1558 and was created Lord Burleigh in 1571. He also acted as Lord Treasurer and so was responsible for the government's money. He had considerable influence over Elizabeth and her government, including the execution of Mary Queen of Scots in 1587 and the war with Spain, which led to the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. He was a passionate defender of Elizabeth's religious settlement. He opposed Catholic or Puritan attempts to undermine it. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, was an ambitious and close confidant of the Queen, especially in the early years. Dudley received estates from the Queen and became an influential figure on the Privy Council. This was new power which brought him into conflict with William Cecil. It was rumoured that Elizabeth and Dudley were lovers, a rumour reinforced by the unexplained death of Dudley's wife, Amy. Dudley's behaviour caused scandal, especially his affairs with Baroness Sheffield and Lettice Knollys, wife of Walter Devereux, the Earl of Essex, and both affairs resulted in children and led to him being banished from court. He was a strong supporter of Protestantism in England and the Spanish Netherlands, where he had led military expeditions. And the last minister is Francis Walsingham. He was a Member of Parliament for Lyme Regis before becoming the Queen's private secretary in 1573. He was closely involved in attending to the Queen's security. He ran a network of spies and agents provocateurs and informers who uncovered plots against the Queen, including the Babington and Throckmorton plots. Agent provocateurs were people employed by Walsingham to encourage those who were against the Queen to plot against her. This then justified the later arrest and execution of the plotters. So Walsingham used ciphers or codes in all correspondence and developed ways of deciphering the codes of those who plotted against the Queen. Why were Elizabeth's ministers important? Well, Elizabeth trusted her ministers and allowed them to shape government policy during her reign. Cecil and Walsingham had seats in Parliament and were able to monitor the opinion of those in the Commons and the Lords. They could persuade MPs to turn government policy then into law. The desire to influence the Queen led to rivalries at court, especially involving Robert Dudley and William Cecil, and later between Robert Cecil and Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Join me in the next video where we will look at the difficulties of being a female ruler.